March 19th, 1945. The skies above Nuremberg burned with tracer fire as Leutnant Klaus Weber pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a desperate climbing turn. His squadron had been bounced again, the third time that week, by American P-51 Mustangs, operating with a tactical aggression that felt less like warfare and more like systematic extermination. Weber's wingman, Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, didn't make it through the first pass. The American pilot who killed him didn't just shoot and disengage. He followed Dietrich's crippled fighter all the way down, firing continuously, ensuring there would be no bailout, no survival, no mercy. Weber survived only because his engine quit at 8,000 meters, forcing him into a dead-stick glide that the Mustangs apparently deemed not worth the ammunition. As he climbed from his cockpit at the emergency field near Ansbach, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from rage. The Americans didn't fight like the British. They didn't fight like the Russians. They fought like men who had come specifically to kill you, personally, and would pursue that goal with industrial efficiency and unlimited resources until the job was done. This was the fourth pilot Weber had lost to American fighters in 2 weeks. Each death followed the same pattern: aggressive pursuit, overwhelming numbers, no quarter given, no escape possible. The hatred German pilots felt toward their American counterparts wasn't born from propaganda or ideology. It was born from the sky itself, from watching friends die in ways that seemed less like combat and more like execution, from facing an enemy who combined technical superiority with a personal ruthlessness that transformed every engagement into a hunt where Germans were always the prey. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The roots of this hatred reached back to 1943, when American fighters first began appearing over German-occupied Europe in significant numbers. Initially, Luftwaffe pilots viewed them with the same professional respect they afforded the Royal Air Force, seeing them as fellow warriors in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat. That perception lasted approximately 3 weeks. By August of 1943, German pilots, returning from encounters with American fighters, brought back reports that seemed almost hysterical in their intensity, claims that were initially dismissed as combat stress or exaggeration. Hauptmann Friedrich Radke, a veteran of the Battle of Britain with 27 confirmed kills, filed a report after an engagement near Schweinfurt that captured the essence of what would become universal German pilot experience with Americans. The American fighters attacked with a ferocity that exceeded anything I experienced over England. They did not maneuver for advantage. They simply came straight at us, firing from ranges we would consider suicidal. When we turned to engage, more appeared from above. When we dove away, they followed all the way to ground level. They fought not like pilots seeking victory, but like executioners pursuing criminals. 3 of my staffel did not return. I believe all 3 were shot after their aircraft were already crippled. This is not war as we have known it. This is something else entirely. Radke's report was filed and largely ignored by higher command, attributed to the shock of facing a new opponent. But within months, every Jagdgeschwader, every fighter wing, every individual pilot who survived contact with American fighters was repeating the same experience. The Americans fought differently. They fought harder. They fought meaner. And most disturbing of all, they seemed to take personal satisfaction in killing German pilots even after tactical objectives were achieved. The difference became apparent in how the 3 Allied air forces approached combat at the most fundamental level: British pilots, shaped by the defensive battles of 1940 and 1941, fought with tactical discipline and professional restraint. They would engage German fighters when necessary to protect their bombers. But once the immediate threat was neutralized, they returned to their primary mission. Soviet pilots, brutal as they were, fought with the fury of men defending their homeland from invaders. Their aggression was understandable, even predictable. They would pursue German aircraft relentlessly, but their tactics were often crude, relying on numerical superiority rather than systematic methodology. American pilots brought something entirely different to the sky, a combination of technological advantage, tactical aggression, and personal ruthlessness that German pilots found psychologically devastating. They didn't just want to win the engagement. They wanted to eliminate every German aircraft in the sky, kill every German pilot who climbed into a cockpit, and ensure that survivors carried back tales that would demoralize their squadrons. It was warfare designed not just to achieve air superiority, but to break the will of the opposing force through systematic psychological domination. The tactical differences manifested in ways that German pilots experienced as deeply personal affronts. When engaging British fighters, Luftwaffe pilots knew the rules, understood the boundaries. If a German pilot was damaged and trying to disengage, British pilots would usually let them go, focusing on active threats. If a Luftwaffe pilot bailed out, British fighters would typically leave them alone, respecting the unwritten code that a pilot in a parachute was out of the fight. American pilots ignored these conventions entirely. Oberleutnant Werner Müller, flying with Jagdgeschwader 26, documented his first encounter with this American approach in his personal diary, an entry discovered by historians decades later. Today I watched Lieutenant Schaefer take hits from a P-47. His engine was smoking, clearly finished. He was attempting to glide back to base when the American made 3 more passes, firing until Schaefer's aircraft disintegrated. Schaefer was already out of the fight. The American killed him anyway, methodically, without hurry. When I moved to intervene, 2 more P-47s appeared from nowhere, as if they had been waiting specifically for someone to try helping. This is not the way civilized nations conduct war. This is extermination. The American tactic of hunting damaged aircraft was reported so consistently that it became a standard element of Luftwaffe combat briefings. German pilots learned to expect that any sign of damage would trigger immediate and overwhelming attention from American fighters, who would pursue wounded aircraft with the persistence of predators who sensed an easy kill. This wasn't occasional occurrence, or the action of individual aggressive pilots. This was systematic, practiced, seemingly encouraged by American command structure. The psychological impact was devastating because it transformed every engagement into a binary outcome: complete escape or probable death. There was no middle ground of surviving with damage, no possibility of limping home with a shot-up aircraft, no prospect of bailing out safely if things went badly. Against American fighters, German pilots learned that once you were hit, you were marked for death, and the Americans would invest whatever time and ammunition necessary to ensure that death occurred. The hunting of parachuting pilots represented an even darker dimension of American tactical aggression. International law and the unwritten codes of aerial warfare considered pilots in parachutes to be out of combat, non-threatening, essentially shipwrecked sailors floating helplessly. The Royal Air Force largely observed this convention. The Soviet Air Force violated it occasionally in the fury of combat over their homeland. American fighters made it standard practice. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt of Jagdgeschwader 3 survived being shot down by P-51s in January of 1944. His account, given during debriefing at a field hospital, became one of hundreds documenting American willingness to shoot parachuting pilots. My aircraft was hit in the first pass. I knew immediately it was finished. The engine was gone. Fire spreading back toward the cockpit, I rolled inverted and dropped clear at 4,000 meters. As my chute opened, I saw the Mustang that had shot me down circle back. I thought he was ensuring I was clear of my aircraft, perhaps photographing the kill for confirmation. Instead, he made a firing pass directly at me. I felt the bullets snap past, heard them tearing through the silk above my head. He made 3 passes in total, before apparently running low on ammunition and departing. 2 panels of my parachute were shredded. I landed hard, broke my leg, but survived. The American pilot had tried to murder me while I hung defenseless in my parachute. This was not war. This was assassination. Schmidt's experience was far from unique. By mid-1944, German pilot briefings included specific instructions on parachute evasion tactics. Don't deploy your chute immediately if you had altitude. Free fall as long as possible to reduce time. Hanging vulnerable. Pull hard on the risers to oscillate and make yourself a harder target. Aim for cloud cover or forest where you would be harder to see. These were tactics necessitated specifically by American willingness to shoot at parachuting pilots. The practice became so widespread that some German pilots began carrying pistols not for use if captured, but to shoot at American pilots if they attempted parachute attacks. It was a form of aerial warfare that felt less like military combat and more like murder, and it generated hatred of an intensity that exceeded anything German pilots felt toward other Allied forces. The numerical superiority Americans enjoyed amplified this hatred into something approaching despair. British fighter sweeps typically involved squadrons of 12 to 24 aircraft, manageable numbers where German pilots with superior aircraft and good positioning could still achieve favorable exchange ratios. Soviet fighters operated in larger formations, but with less coordination, creating opportunities for experienced German pilots to exploit gaps and confusion. American fighter operations brought swarms that seemed endless, waves of fighters that appeared in formations of 50, 80, 100 aircraft, coordinated with radio precision, operating with tactical discipline that prevented the kind of exploitation German pilots had learned against Soviet mass formations. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, with 352 confirmed kills, described American formations in his post-war debriefing with a tone that mixed professional respect with personal frustration. Fighting the Americans was like fighting a machine. They flew in perfect formation, maintaining mutual support, coordinating attacks. With radio precision, we could hear but not jam effectively. If you attacked one element, 3 others would immediately converge on your position. If you damaged one aircraft, 2 others would cover its retreat, while 4 more would hunt you. Every American fighter seemed to know where every other American fighter was at all times. They operated as a single organism with 100 eyes and 100 weapons, all focused on killing you. Against such forces, individual skill meant nothing. Only running meant survival, and even that was temporary. The technological superiority of American fighters drove the hatred even deeper, because it meant German pilots couldn't even rely on aircraft performance to escape unfavorable situations. Early in the war, Luftwaffe pilots flying Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had enjoyed performance advantages over most Allied fighters. These advantages allowed skilled pilots to dictate engagement terms, attacking when favorable, escaping when outnumbered. American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang beginning in late 1943, eliminated these advantages and actually reversed them. The Mustang could outrun German fighters in level flight, could outdive them, could match them in climb rate, and possessed range that allowed them to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. German pilots suddenly found themselves flying inferior aircraft against numerically superior opponents who were also better equipped. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, who survived the war with 33 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary about the psychological impact of this technological disadvantage. The Mustang is faster than our 109 in level flight and in a dive. It has better high-altitude performance. It has twice our range. It can turn inside our 190 at most speeds. American pilots are adequately trained. Not brilliant, but competent. and their aircraft makes up for any skill deficiency. We are flying obsolete machines against technologically superior opponents who outnumber us 10 to 1. Every mission is survival training. We no longer speak of victories, only of returning alive. The hatred comes from helplessness. We cannot run from them. We cannot outfight them. We can only die or survive through luck that runs out eventually for everyone. The P-47 Thunderbolt, while lacking the Mustang's elegance and range, brought its own source of German pilot hatred through sheer durability and firepower. The Thunderbolt could absorb damage that would destroy any German fighter, its radial engine and robust construction allowing it to survive. Hits that would have been instantly fatal to a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Worse still, its 8 50 caliber machine guns delivered a weight of fire that could literally saw a German fighter in half in a 2-second burst. Lieutenant Josef Priller, who flew throughout the entire war and ended with 101 confirmed kills, described the psychological impact of facing Thunderbolts in a 1944 letter to his brother. "You cannot hurt them. I have fired cannon rounds into Thunderbolts that should have destroyed them instantly. They smoke, they leak fluid, they continue fighting. I once saw a Thunderbolt return to England with over 200 holes in it from cannon and machine gun fire. Its pilot landed successfully and was flying again the next day. Meanwhile, a single burst from a Thunderbolt's guns will disintegrate our aircraft. The unfairness of it generates rage. We are flying paper airplanes against armored machines, throwing stones at men with rifles. The Americans waste their advantages like rich men waste money, careless and contemptuous because they have unlimited more where that came from. The range advantage of American fighters particularly enraged German pilots because it eliminated the one sanctuary they had previously enjoyed: distance. Early in the war, German fighters operating over Britain had been limited by fuel range, forced to break off the combat and return to base before British fighters ran out of fuel in their own airspace. This dynamic gave defending British pilots a crucial advantage. By 1944, American fighters had reversed this equation entirely. Mustangs could escort bombers to any target in Germany, fight for extended periods over the target, and still have fuel reserves to hunt German fighters on the return journey. German pilots who survived the initial bomber escort battle found themselves being hunted by American fighters with hours of fuel remaining, turning what should have been safe German airspace into an endless killing ground. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, an experienced ace with 176 confirmed kills, described this psychological reversal in his post-war memoirs. "We used to calculate fuel carefully, knowing British fighters had to return to base. Time was our ally. With Americans, time became our enemy. They would arrive with our bombers, fight for 30 minutes, then orbit our airfields waiting for us to land. We called them vultures. They would wait, hours if necessary, knowing we had to land. Eventually, knowing our fuel was lower than theirs, knowing we were most vulnerable on approach. Landing became more dangerous than combat. We lost dozens of pilots, shot down on final approach by Americans who had been circling for hours, specifically waiting for this moment. They turned our own bases into traps. There was nowhere safe, no sanctuary, no moment when we could relax our guard. The psychological strain was unsustainable. The American practice of strafing German airfields represented another escalation that British and Soviet forces rarely attempted with the same systematic intensity. Starting in late 1943, American fighter groups began dedicating entire missions to low-level attacks on German airfields, catching aircraft on the ground, destroying them during takeoff and landing, killing pilots in their cockpits before they could even become airborne. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous, requiring fighters to descend into intense anti-aircraft fire. But Americans flew them repeatedly with apparently unlimited willingness to accept losses in exchange for destroyed German aircraft. Lieutenant Günther Rall, who survived the war with 275 confirmed kills, making him the third highest-scoring ace in history, described the impact of these airfield attacks in a 1944 report to his commanding officer. "The Americans have taken away our last advantage, the safety of our own bases. Yesterday, P-47s attacked our field at Rhine during morning takeoff. They destroyed 11 aircraft on the ground and killed 4 pilots in their cockpits waiting for takeoff clearance. One pilot, Lieutenant Becker, was killed sitting in his aircraft with his engine not yet started. He never had a chance to fight, never had a chance to defend himself. He was simply murdered in his cockpit by an American who came in at 50 meters altitude firing into parked aircraft. This afternoon, Mustangs attacked again during our landing pattern. 2 aircraft were shot down on final approach, both pilots killed. We are losing more pilots on our own airfield than in combat. The Americans have made even the ground unsafe. Where are we supposed to be safe? Where can we rest without fear of sudden death? The answer is nowhere. They have made all of Germany a combat zone, every moment a potential death moment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The systematic nature of American attacks on German pilot training facilities and replacement aircraft represented a strategic approach that German pilots experienced as personally threatening in ways beyond individual combat. Americans didn't just want to win today's battle. They wanted to ensure Germany couldn't replace losses, couldn't train new pilots, couldn't rebuild fighter strength. American bombers repeatedly struck aircraft factories, bearing plants, aluminum refineries, and synthetic fuel production facilities. American fighters strafed training fields where student pilots flew obsolete aircraft, killing instructors and students who possessed no combat capability. The targeting was methodical, comprehensive, designed to strangle the Luftwaffe, not just through combat attrition, but through systematic destruction of the entire pilot production pipeline. Oberst Johannes Trautloft, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, documented this strategic strangulation in his official war diary. "The Americans are not fighting a war. They are implementing an extermination program. They bomb our factories so we cannot build aircraft. They bomb our fuel plants so we cannot fly the aircraft we have. They attack our training schools so we cannot train new pilots. They strafe our replacement aircraft during ferry flights so new machines never reach operational units. And when we somehow manage to get new pilots into combat aircraft, American fighters are waiting in overwhelming numbers to kill them on their first mission. I received 32 replacement pilots last month. 19 are already dead. The average combat life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot in early 1945 was 4 missions, approximately 2 weeks. Against British fighters, that number had been 3 months. The difference was the American systematic approach to killing every German pilot who entered a cockpit. The hatred German pilots felt toward Americans reached its psychological peak not in 1943, when American fighters first appeared in force, not in 1944, when the Mustangs began escorting bombers to Berlin, but in the final months of 1945, when the war was clearly lost, and American pilots continued hunting German fighters with undiminished ferocity. By March of 1945, every rational German pilot knew the war was over. The Reich was collapsing from east and west, fuel supplies had been reduced to a trickle, replacement aircraft arrived sporadically, if at all, and the Luftwaffe's operational strength had been reduced to a fraction of its 1943 levels. Yet, American fighters continued their systematic extermination campaign with an intensity that seemed to increase as German resistance weakened. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who survived the war with 301 confirmed kills, making him the second highest-scoring ace in history, described this final phase in his post-war testimony with barely contained bitterness. "The Americans knew we were finished. They could see our fuel shortages, our lack of replacements, our obsolete aircraft held together with the salvaged parts. They could have simply maintained air superiority and waited for the inevitable collapse. Instead, They hunted us with increased aggression, as if determined that every single German pilot must die before the war ended. In April of 1945, I watched American fighters strafe a crash-landed German pilot who was standing beside his wrecked aircraft waving a white cloth. They killed him anyway. Not in the heat of combat, not by accident, but deliberately, circling back to ensure he was dead. This was not military necessity. This was a murder driven by hatred that exceeded our own. The American practice of radio communication during combat intensified German pilot hatred in ways that went beyond tactical disadvantage. British pilots maintained radio discipline using brief coded transmissions that were professional and impersonal. Soviet pilots rarely used radios effectively, relying instead on visual signals and pre-briefed tactics. American pilots filled the airwaves with constant chatter that German pilots could hear but not jam, communications that revealed not just tactical information, but emotional states that seemed designed to demoralize. Lieutenant Heinrich Erler, flying with Jagdgeschwader 5 in Norway before transferring to Reich Defense, documented the psychological impact of American radio intercepts in a 1944 letter to his family that was never sent, discovered among his effects after his death in April of 1945. We can hear them talking. Their radios are powerful, their transmissions clear even when we cannot respond. They call out our positions to each other with casual efficiency, coordinating attacks with voices that sound like men discussing a hunting trip rather than mortal combat. I have heard American pilots laugh over the radio after shooting down a comrade. I have heard them make jokes about German aircraft spinning toward Earth with pilots trapped inside. The British never did this. They fought with cold professionalism. The Americans fight with hot enthusiasm, as if killing us brings them genuine pleasure rather than grim satisfaction. Hearing your death being arranged by men who sound like they are enjoying themselves, this generates hatred beyond anything I have felt toward any enemy. They are not soldiers to us. They are executioners who love their work. The disparity in survival rates between pilots shot down over Germany by different Allied nationalities provided stark statistical evidence of the differential treatment that fueled German hatred toward Americans. Luftwaffe intelligence compiled reports throughout 1944 comparing the fates of German pilots forced to bail out over German territory after being shot down by British, Soviet, or American fighters. The numbers revealed patterns that German pilots experienced viscerally, but high command could now document statistically. Of German pilots shot down by British fighters over German territory who successfully bailed out, approximately 78% survived to return to their units after recovery from injuries. Of those shot down by Soviet fighters over German-held territory in the east, approximately 62% survived, with the lower rate attributed primarily to the intensity of ground combat making recovery more difficult. Of German pilots shot down by American fighters over German territory who successfully bailed out, only 41% survived to return to duty. The difference was attributed directly to American practice of shooting at parachuting pilots and pursuing damaged aircraft until they crashed, rather than allowing crippled machines to attempt emergency landings. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, reviewing these statistics in his capacity as fighter operations commander, added a handwritten note to the report that captured the emotional reality behind the numbers. These statistics represent murdered comrades, not combat losses. A pilot in a parachute is harmless, out of the fight, entitled to survival under all civilized rules of warfare. The Americans kill them anyway. A pilot in a damaged aircraft, attempting to glide to an emergency landing, represents no further military threat and historically has been allowed to attempt survival. The Americans pursue them to ground level and ensure their death. This is not superior fighting spirit. This is systematic murder dressed in military uniform. Our pilots know these numbers. They know that being shot down by Americans carries twice the fatality rate of being shot down by British. This knowledge breeds hatred that cannot be measured statistically, but can be heard in every combat briefing, seen in every pilot's eyes before a mission against American forces. We hate them, not because they defeat us, but because they kill us when defeat has already been achieved. The technological advances American fighters introduced in the final year of the war pushed German pilot hatred into realms of near-superstitious dread. The appearance of the P-51D model in late 1944 brought performance improvements that made an already superior fighter virtually untouchable by standard German interceptors. The later addition of K-14 gyroscopic gun sights allowed American pilots to hit German aircraft from angles and ranges previously impossible, making evasive maneuvers that had worked against earlier fighters suddenly useless. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, who ended the war with 220 confirmed kills, including 16 in the Me-262 jet fighter, described the psychological impact of facing these technological improvements in a captured document recovered after the war. Every month, the Americans appear with some new advantage: better engines, better sights, better radios, better tactics, better everything. We develop countermeasures, and they render them obsolete within weeks. When we finally received the Me-262 jet, which could outrun any American fighter, they simply changed tactics and caught us during takeoff and landing when we were slow and vulnerable. Every advantage we gain, they neutralize through superior numbers, superior technology, or superior tactical adaptation. Fighting them is like fighting the future itself, knowing that tomorrow they will be even stronger while we grow weaker. The hatred comes not from their strength alone, but from the certainty that their strength is limitless while ours diminishes daily. We are yesterday's warriors fighting tomorrow's military with today's desperation. The personal accounts of German pilots who survived being shot down and captured by American forces reveal a complex, emotional landscape where hatred born from aerial combat collided with unexpected treatment as prisoners. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who survived the war with 28 confirmed kills, experienced this collision after being shot down by P-47s in October of 1944. His subsequent treatment as a prisoner of war created cognitive dissonance that he struggled to reconcile for decades after the war. In his memoirs, published in 1992, he wrote with lingering confusion, "The American pilot who shot me down pursued my aircraft all the way to ground level, firing continuously until my Fokker-Wulf was so damaged that I crashed on emergency landing. I expected to die. Instead, American ground troops who captured me provided immediate medical attention, treated my injuries with care I had not expected, and transported me to a hospital where I received treatment equal to what American wounded received." The contrast was psychologically devastating. In the air, Americans fought like men, determined to kill every German pilot. Personally, on the ground, they treated me with Geneva Convention correctness and even occasional kindness. I could not reconcile these two behaviors. Were they the same people? How could men so ruthless in combat be so correct as captors? I spent years trying to understand this duality and concluded that Americans separated the fight from the fighter in ways we never did. They would kill you without mercy in combat because they saw the killing as necessary work. Once you were captured and no longer a threat, they reverted to their natural character, which was generally decent. This separation of roles, this ability to be ruthless when necessary and humane when possible, this was perhaps their greatest advantage over us. We could never achieve this balance. The legend of the Zemke Wolfpack demonstrated how certain American fighter units became particular objects of German pilot hatred due to their aggressive tactics and high kill rates. The 56th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke, operated P-47 Thunderbolts with a tactical philosophy that emphasized aggressive pursuit, ground attack, and the systematic destruction of German air power through any means necessary. German pilots learned to identify Zemke's group by their tactics and radio chatter and intelligence reports documented the pilots would sometimes refuse to engage when the 56th was identified in the area, preferring to break off and preserve aircraft rather than face near-certain destruction. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke recorded an encounter with the 56th in his diary that captured why this particular unit generated such specific hatred. Today, we encountered the Zemke group. We knew immediately from their formation, discipline, and radio coordination. My staffel of 8 aircraft faced approximately 40 Thunderbolts. We had altitude advantage and good position for a diving attack on their bombers. Zemke's pilots ignored the bombers they were supposed to be escorting and came straight for us, climbing to meet us despite tactical disadvantage. They fought with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if they had been waiting specifically for us. Within 10 minutes, 5 of my 8 aircraft were destroyed. I survived only because my aircraft was hit early, and I successfully crash-landed in a field. As I climbed from the wreckage, Thunderbolts made 3 strafing passes at me on the ground, stopping only when German anti-aircraft fire forced them to altitude. This was the Zemke way, total commitment to killing German pilots, regardless of cost or conventional tactics. We feared them more than any other American unit because they seemed to take genuine pleasure in our destruction. The final weeks of the war brought German pilot hatred toward Americans to its ultimate expression, as pilots who knew the war was lost continued flying missions, not for military victory, but simply to avoid falling into Soviet hands, preferring to surrender to Americans despite their ruthless combat tactics. This preference revealed a grudging acknowledgement that American hatred was limited to combat itself, while Soviet treatment of prisoners was known to be universally harsh regardless of resistance. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace, deliberately flew west in May of 1945 to ensure his capture by Americans rather than Soviets, despite having spent years fighting primarily on the Eastern Front, where Americans were rarely encountered. His reasoning, recorded in post-war debriefing, reflected the complex calculation German pilots made in those final days. The Americans will try to kill you in the air with maximum efficiency and minimum mercy, but once you are captured, they generally observe the Geneva Convention. The Soviets will capture you alive, if possible, specifically to ensure prolonged suffering. Given the choice between enemies who fight ruthlessly but behave correctly after victory and enemies who fight ruthlessly and continue punishing after victory, the choice is obvious. I hated American pilots for their combat tactics, for the friends they killed, for the callousness with which they hunted us, but I chose to surrender to them because I knew their hatred ended when the fighting ended. This distinction mattered in those final days when all that remained was choosing how to survive defeat. The post-war reckoning forced German pilots to confront the reality that American tactical ruthlessness had been matched by German strategic criminality in ways that made moral judgments about combat tactics seem almost absurdly trivial. As the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable, surviving Luftwaffe pilots faced the uncomfortable recognition that while they had hated Americans for killing them without mercy in aerial combat, the regime they had served had committed industrial genocide against millions of non-combatants. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war and later became Chief of Staff of the West German Air Force and Chairman of NATO's Military Committee, wrote about this moral reckoning in his 1972 memoir. With painful honesty, we hated the Americans for shooting at us in parachutes, for pursuing damaged aircraft, for attacking us on our own airfields. We felt these were violations of civilized warfare, criminal acts that exceeded military necessity. Then we learned about the concentration camps, the systematic murder of millions, the industrial-scale criminality of the regime we had served. Suddenly, our complaints about American combat tactics seemed pathetically small. Yes, Americans fought ruthlessly. They killed German pilots without mercy or hesitation. But they were fighting to defeat a regime that murdered children in gas chambers. Our hatred of American pilots had been based on their effectiveness at killing us. Their hatred of us had been based on what we represented, what we defended, what we enabled through our service. When I finally understood this, my hatred transformed into shame. The statistical record of German pilot losses reveals the mathematical reality behind the emotional experience of systematic destruction by American fighters. From January of 1943 through May of 1945, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 15,000 fighter pilots killed in action or missing, with another 22,000 wounded, seriously enough to remove them from combat status. Of the killed or missing, American fighters were credited with approximately 6,800 direct kills, roughly 45% of total losses. British fighters accounted for approximately 3,200 kills, Soviet fighters approximately 4,000, with the remainder lost to anti-aircraft fire, accidents, and other causes. But these raw numbers mask the more significant reality of when and where these losses occurred. In the critical period from June of 1944 through March of 1945, when Germany needed experienced pilots most desperately to defend against the strategic bombing campaign, American fighters accounted for 72% of German pilot deaths in the Western Theater. The concentrated efficiency of this killing, the systematic way American fighters found and destroyed German pilots during the most critical period of the air war, justified the hatred German pilots felt, even as it demonstrated why that hatred was militarily irrelevant. Americans were killing German pilots faster than they could be replaced, faster than they could be trained, faster than tactical adjustments could be implemented. The hatred was deserved from a German perspective because the killing was effective beyond anything the Luftwaffe could counter. The personal accounts of the few German pilots who survived the entire war provide the most powerful testimony to why hatred toward American fighter pilots exceeded hatred toward any other Allied force. These men had fought British, French, Polish, Soviet, and American pilots, had experienced combat from the skies over England to the steppes of Russia, had survived years of aerial warfare that killed 90% of their initial training classes. When asked in post-war interviews which enemy they had hated most intensely, their answer was nearly universal: the Americans. Not because Americans were more evil, not because American tactics violated laws of warfare more severely than Soviet tactics, not because Americans had caused them more personal loss than years of fighting on the Eastern Front. They hated Americans because American fighters represented industrial warfare perfected into an instrument of systematic destruction that made individual skill, personal courage, and tactical innovation irrelevant. General Leutnant Adolf Galland, who ended the war as commander of an elite jet fighter unit, after spending most of the war as general of fighters responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, summarized this hatred in his 1954 memoir with bitter eloquence. The British we respected. They had fought us to a standstill in 1940 when they were weak and we were strong. They had earned admiration through courage against odds. The Soviets we feared. They had manpower without limit and hatred without bound. But we understood them. They were fighting for survival of their homeland. The Americans we hated. They came late to the war when the outcome was already decided, fought with overwhelming material advantage, and killed us with industrial efficiency, as if we were products to be eliminated rather than warriors to be defeated. They brought to aerial combat the same assembly line mentality they brought to manufacturing. They produced fighters faster than we could destroy them, trained pilots faster than we could kill them, and replaced losses faster than we could inflict them. Fighting them was not combat between warriors. It was extermination by an industrial process we could not match or counter. We hated them because they proved that warfare had become an industrial competition, where the side with more factories would inevitably defeat the side with more courage. They made us obsolete while we still lived. The reunion between former Luftwaffe pilots and their American counterparts, which began in the 1970s and continues to this day, has revealed that American pilots understood exactly what they were doing and accepted that German hatred was the inevitable consequence of effective warfare. At a 1983 reunion in Dayton, Ohio, former members of the 4th Fighter Group met with surviving members of Jagdgeschwader 26, the German fighter wing they had fought against throughout 1944 and 45. The conversations recorded by military historians revealed remarkable emotional complexity on both sides. Colonel Don Blakesley, who had led the 4th Fighter Group through some of the most brutal air combat of the war, listened as former Oberleutnant Joseph Priller described watching his wingman shot out of his parachute by an American Mustang in March of 1945. Blakesley's response, delivered without defensiveness or apology, captured the American perspective. We came to destroy the Luftwaffe, not to defeat it, not to achieve air superiority, but to destroy it completely so thoroughly that you could never threaten our bombers again. We were ordered to be aggressive, to pursue damaged aircraft, to attack your airfields, to give no quarter and expect none. We knew you would hate us for it. We accepted that hatred as the price of effectiveness. You were fighting for Nazi Germany, defending a criminal regime. We were fighting to end that regime by any means necessary. If that meant killing you in your parachute, we did it. If that meant strafing your airfields, we did it. If that meant pursuing your damaged aircraft to ensure you couldn't return to fight another day, we did it. You deserved better than the regime you served. But while you served it, you deserved exactly what you got, which was total war, fought with maximum efficiency and minimum mercy. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then Priller, who had survived the war with 101 confirmed kills, stood and offered his hand to Blakesley. "You are honest," he said. "We hated you then. We understand you now. You did what was necessary. We would have done the same if we had possessed your resources." The Americans took his hand, and in that moment, the hatred that had defined their relationship for 40 years dissolved into mutual recognition of what warriors become when nations commit them to total war. The final accounting of why German pilots hated American fighter pilots more than any other Allied force comes down to a simple truth that transcends tactical details or personal grievances. Americans represented the future of warfare, a future where industrial capacity would matter more than individual skill, where systematic destruction would replace warrior codes, where efficiency would trump chivalry, and where wars would be won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the most productive economies. German pilots, products of a military tradition that valued individual excellence, tactical brilliance, and warrior honor, were being systematically destroyed by men who approached combat as a production problem to be solved through superior resources and ruthless efficiency. The hatred was existential. It was the hatred of the craftsman for the assembly line, the hatred of the individual warrior for the industrial army, the hatred of the past for the future. American fighter pilots in World War II proved that modern warfare had moved beyond the realm where personal valor and tactical skill could overcome material disadvantage. They killed German pilots not through superior flying ability, though many possessed that, not through greater courage, though they demonstrated plenty, but through overwhelming numbers, superior technology, unlimited fuel and ammunition, better training pipelines, and tactical doctrines that emphasized systematic destruction over individual glory. They fought the way America built cars, as an industrial process where every component worked together to produce maximum output with minimum waste. German pilots hated them for it because that hatred was the last refuge of warriors who knew they were obsolete. The sky above Germany had become a factory floor where American workers in flight suits processed German pilots into casualty statistics with the same efficiency that Detroit processed steel into tanks. The hatred was real, deeply felt, and ultimately irrelevant. By the time German pilots understood why they hated Americans so intensely, the war was already over, and the future Americans represented had already arrived. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.